All right, hey guys. Part two of the medical model of mental health presentation. Again, this is a presentation that I gave last year for a policy class that I had for my degree. So, last video ran pretty long, so I'll try to keep this one concise. I think this will be part two, and I think there will be a part three, depending how quickly and concisely I can get through this. So without further ado, picking up where we left off. So iatrogenesis in psychiatry. So remember, let's go back to the slide before. Why? Sorry. This one. So I believe that there are three primary dangers and limitations of the medical model, specifically with respect to clinical diagnosis, which, as we saw in the previous part one, is a fundamental component of the medical model of mental health and how it's practiced. So, the three main dangers and limitations of clinical diagnosis are the potential for iatrogenesis. Okay, and we looked at a little bit of last time. I gave a model of how I think that happens. It's kind of a vicious cycle of, believing and identifying with certain ideas, taking on behaviors that reinforce those ideas, and then having your therapist kind of reinforce those ideas by virtue of, the medical model in practice and how they practice. So I gave that model, and we're still on iatrogenesis right now. I think that's the biggest. I think that's the point out of all these three that I give the most attention. But I think last time I mentioned 1 and 3 are equally important in my view. Point 2 is not that important as I reflect back on it. It is still important. I should say it is still important, but maybe it's not. It's perhaps a bit more tentative than I had initially thought. So, talked a little about Gabor Mate's assessment of clinical diagnosis and mental health treatment. Okay, so iatrogenesis in psychiatry. So, this study is, I'll just read the title: The Serotonin Theory of Depression, a Systematic Umbrella Review of the Evidence. For those of you who don't know, a systematic review is the highest form of academic literature that you can do. Essentially, it's a study that looks at multiple studies and basically takes assessments, makes an assessment based on the findings of all of those studies together. Within that, they have utilized 12. Oh, excuse me. This is a systematic umbrella review. So within the systematic umbrella review, they reviewed 12 systematic reviews. Okay, so as I just explained, systematic review is the highest form of academic literature because it looks at many different studies. While they looked at 12 of those studies in this study, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which is another, kind of the step below systematic reviews. So it's also a very statistically powerful study to gather inference from. And yeah, just other kinds of meta-analyses and the other studies that they utilize. So what they concluded from this study, I won't get into it, though I encourage you to look at the study itself so that you can you can see the evidence for yourself. What they concluded from this study and this is a recent study, 2022, is that, I'll just read here, our comprehensive review of the major strands of research on serotonin shows that there is no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activities. Okay. I'm going to read that again for emphasis because it's just very breathtaking, as someone who is kind of ingrained in a lot of mental health research and discussion and all that. Our comprehensive review of the major strands of research, again, very, very empirically strong data that they're using here. I really can't understate how, incredible this study is, that they took so many different studies, so many different systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and synthesized all of that data into this study. It's phenomenal research. It's great research. It's even if this wasn't the topic of interest, I mean, to have a study like this at all is truly remarkable from a research standpoint. Excuse me. So, our comprehensive review of the major strands of research on serotonin shows that there is no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity. Okay, let that sink in while I get some water. Okay, so that's crazy. That's, if you have been diagnosed yourself with depression, and either sought out or have been prescribed psychiatric medication for depression, chances are you are taking a medication that's specifically designed to act on the serotonin system. I believe, so this term right here, I wish I could highlight it, but SSRIs, it's an acronym for probably the most common medication that you'll find prescribed for depression, which stands for serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. So again, they're drugs that are specifically designed to work on the serotonin system as their mechanism of action. Well, as we see in this incredible study, and I'm just going to keep saying it, I really can't understate how incredible this study is. Even if the content had nothing to do with mental health or this theme in general, it is a phenomenal study, and so therefore, the conclusions that it draws. Sorry, my car was making noise. And so the conclusions that it draws are truly remarkable as well. Very, very, very much founded in the hard data. And so it's a big pill to swallow, no pun intended. To walk away with these things that were prescribed. I don't know if Zoloft is an SSRI. I think it is, but Zoloft, escitalopram, I don't know too many other ones off the top of my head, but that these extremely commonly prescribed drugs that people receive in order to treat their symptoms of depression, well, they don't even act. There's no evidence to suggest that they even work. from a purely scientific research perspective, okay, there's no evidence to suggest, again, as they say, that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity. I didn't include this in this study because it wasn't super pertinent, but if, for those of you who are, politically savvy, it won't come as a surprise that when we trace the origins of where this notion that serotonin is responsible for depression, that it's the mechanism, that it's the underlying cause, right? At a biological level, that this notion is entirely crafted by the private, by companies who make these medications. I don't know why I'm blanking on the term, but companies like Pfizer and companies who are in the industry of making money. They released very tentative research, I believe back in the 80s, that suggested that serotonin might potentially have something to do with depression. Very tentative evidence, and ran several propaganda campaigns over the years. I think it's actually, if you look up the history of the development of the MHPAEA, which I'll cover, I believe, in this presentation as well, the Mental Health Parity and Equity Act, which is basically a law that says that insurance providers need to cover mental health just as they cover any other kind of medical treatment. There are big loopholes in that law, which I believe I'll also cover, but that's the idea. Well, it turns out that evidence was complete bullshit. And it just goes to show you that we need to be skeptical of science and of quote-unquote expert opinion. I want to be clear with what I'm saying here, because I don't want this to be misconstrued. I'm not saying that science is complete bullshit. That's not what I'm saying. And I don't believe that, because if I did, I wouldn't be showing you this study. But what I am saying is that we need to be critical in how we consume scientific knowledge and how we, to the extent that we choose to accept something, a claim, as true, just because experts in the field have, given their perspective and their take. We might not be scientists ourselves, but we can still ask questions like, okay, so what's the evidence for that? And if it's not bullshit, the claim will hold up. Science is not this holy artifice that we can never question and never be skeptical of. If it is, then it's not worth paying attention to. It's not worth listening to. So again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying all of science is bullshit. What I am saying is that sometimes we need to do the legwork of digging into this stuff ourselves and questioning, is this right for me? Am I willing to put, am I willing to bet on this being true based on the evidence that I have? Not just taking someone at their word for it just because they have a medical degree or just because they have, a background in medical research. unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of these people are heavily influenced by, corporate money. I won't go into this too long because, again, I want to keep it concise. But think about something like climate change, where for many decades there was this idea pandered around that, well, there's not that much consensus. We're still kind of, debating if climate change is real, and there's still a lot of data to be, sifted through. Well, that was propaganda, and we know that now. And I think that most people, if they take a good look at the evidence for themselves, and if science truly does a good job at disseminating that information to the public in a way that's understandable, right? Which I would say is the responsibility of science and of scientists, then people can probably see for themselves, and probably could have seen early on, even before all the propaganda, yes, this is real. Climate change is a real thing. It's happening. And I'm not going to listen to someone who, is telling me otherwise just because they have a degree. I want to know what their financial interests are. I want to know what the evidence of their claim is. We can ask these questions. And so if there's one takeaway that I have from this slide, I won't get into this too much, but you can read it yourself if you want. If there's one takeaway that I want you to have from this, and from my website and my YouTube channel in general, it's that you have the power to investigate the nature of reality for yourself. Whether that is through direct experience, whether that is through scientific research, and honestly, it should be some combination of both. And philosophical inquiry, and we should feel empowered to look at this world and say, I am capable, if I put in a legitimate and sincere effort into understanding the human mind, the world, the universe, whatever, that I can understand it. And I don't need to rely on models that other people give me and just take them for granted, right? I'm not saying you should just, wave it all away either. Because then, you're gonna miss a lot of good stuff as well. But to have the willingness to investigate for yourself, to be critical, to be skeptical, and the willingness to be wrong, right? There's one here. I'll so you can see me. There's one. There's this guy, Terence McKenna, and I think he is probably the single biggest influence on my thinking. He's not right about everything, but there's one thing that he said, among many, that I really like, and that is, knowledge is provisional. Okay, knowledge is provisional. So, in other words, what that means is that knowledge is only as good as it is right now. In other words, if we, again, use this example, and we see that the expert opinion back in the 80s was that it's serotonin. Serotonin is the culprit of depression, and we need to give people these drugs to enhance their serotonin systems in some way. to substantially reduce these symptoms of depression. That's the prevailing and expert opinion. Well, that was the expert opinion back in the 80s. 40 years later, we have new evidence. And it's the complete opposite. We find that what's true is the complete opposite. So knowledge is truly provisional. And I think this is a mental hurdle that is hard to accept at a very basic instinctual level. And that goes to something else that Terence McKenna said as well, which I really like, and which I've really been struggling a lot with recently, honestly. And that's the idea of living without closure. He basically said living without closure is the only way to truly live. And I really think that's true. For now. Again, we look to this example, and if you had taken the best advice of the times, you would have thought, yes, it's serotonin. Even now, I mean, there's people who have never seen this study. It's unfortunately, the reality is that this study will probably get the attention that it deserves maybe 10, 15 years down the line, and then we'll start to say, oh yeah, well that was, back then. And then what about all the people who, going back to that, I'll wrap up this idea. And then, I'm sorry I jump around so much. I'm practicing speaking, so thank you for being patient. But again, you should feel empowered to do your own investigation and do your own exploration. And I hope this YouTube channel and website truly helps you with that. You are the only person who can see the world in exactly the way that you do. And I don't care how, I don't care if it sounds airy-fairy, or if it sounds like I'm just trying to be optimistic. It's true. There is no one in the entire history of the universe who will see the universe in the same ways that you do, because all of your experiences are unique. Yes, there are other people who have had similar experiences and the same type of experiences. Yes, sure. But you are the only person who can see the world in exactly the same way that you do. Because there's only one you, there's only ever going to be one you, exactly as you are. Without getting into, multiverse theory and all that. But you get what I'm saying. So do your part in trying to figure out this universe full of mysteries, because it is at its core mystery. Anyway, I do want to go over this demographic, actually. So again, knowing that these drugs don't actually help, don't have any effect on depression, because the mechanism that they utilize has been demonstrated to not have any association with or cause for depression, right? And so where does that leave us in terms of actual the actual on the ground reality? So studies show that between 1/3 and 1/2 of people taking antidepressants do not meet the threshold for a full clinical diagnosis. Okay? I'll read that again. Studies show that between 1/3 and 1/2, so 33 to 50% of people taking antidepressants that don't work, that they don't meet the threshold for a full clinical diagnosis. Okay, that's crazy. That's, I mean, it's. I don't want to sound like I'm just trying to create a boogeyman here, but it is. I mean, truly, it's bad. It's bad. There's no other way to put it. It's bad. Currently, 1 in 4 adults are taking SSRIs. Okay, 1 in 4 adults. I believe this is just in the U.S. that the study is referring to. 43 million Americans currently take some form of psychiatric drug, and many of those are SSRIs. And SSRIs, by the way, are not just prescribed for anxiety or depression. They're also prescribed for anxiety, generalized anxiety disorders, and mood disorders like depression. Again, I want to be critical of how we're conceptualizing depression and anxiety in and of themselves, but just for the sake of convenience and convention, I'll just refer to it that way. So these next two statistics are very troubling, to say the least. So, more than half, 56% of people who attempt to come off of antidepressants experience withdrawal effects. Okay, so if you were thinking that, these drugs don't have any effect on depression, so I guess it's basically like taking a sugar pill, right? Well, no, they don't have any direct association with depression, but serotonin is a key neurotransmitter involved in the regulation of mood. That's not disputable. It just doesn't have any direct correlation with what we regard as depression, right? Clinical depression. But more than half of people who attempt to come off of these antidepressants experience withdrawal effects, okay? Comparable to drugs like cocaine or heroin, at the level of addiction, basically. So what it's effectively saying is that these drugs, even though they don't have any positive benefits when it comes to treating depression, can produce, and in most cases, according to this study, in most cases do produce negative results, withdrawal symptoms. That's and so, the next part, nearly half of people who do experience withdrawal effects describe that these effects are severe. Okay? That's egregious. Just sit with that for a second. I'll try to paint the whole picture. This is probably the highest form of research that you will find, and on anything. Just in general, this study is remarkable. I'm not going to stop saying it. It's truly remarkable. Even in a completely different topic of study, this study is bulletproof. Okay? However, and it has shown through its, the conclusions that it's drawn, that serotonin, low levels of serotonin do not cause depression. They do not cause depression, and they are in no way associated with depression. And yet, millions of Americans, and I'm sure this is true in other modern industrial cultures as well, millions of Americans are taking antidepressants to treat depression. I don't have the numbers for how many specifically are taking it for depression. But over half of the people who try to come off of them anyway experience withdrawal effects. Half of whom experience severe withdrawal effects. I mean, this is incredible. It's sad, honestly. And again, the unfortunate reality is that this study is not going to get nearly the attention that it deserves until far down the line, because the propaganda machines of corporate interests are so powerful. I mean, this idea has been around for 40 years now. And, I talk about it here. Throughout the 1990s and beyond, the pharmaceutical industry, I gotta slow down. The pharmaceutical industry promoted the idea that depression was the result of an imbalance or deficiency of brain serotonin, and that SSRIs were magic bullets that reversed the underlying abnormality. I forget which, this is like a historical review. Mark Horowitz, you see his name here, he was one of the key researchers in the previous study that I just showed you. And he wrote this one as well, I guess this is kind of like a more historical overview of how this idea came to be and how it has come to influence so much of the medical view of depression that we use even now. So if you want to read this study, it's incredibly interesting. And it gives you a much more thorough historical analysis of how this idea proliferated, but the takeaway is that it's propaganda, proliferated by corporate interests of pharmaceutical companies. That's the word I was looking for before. I don't know why I forgot. Okay, so that's what this is, and I'll read this part just for emphasis, but I want you to catch how, again, when I say we need to be skeptical of science and that the experts don't have the final say, this is why. Professional organizations such as the American Psychiatric Association, we referred to them last time, I mean, they're kind of the law of the land when it comes to, psychology and psychology research, and that's kind of like, I don't even know, but they're the APA, right? They're the American Psychiatric Association, excuse me. And when they say something, it's kind of taken as fact just because they say it, because I mean it's formed and founded by psychiatrists, medical doctors with medical research backgrounds. So professional organizations such as the APA echoed drug company rhetoric, not the rhetoric of, not even rhetoric, but not the findings, the actual findings of research, of academic research, right? But they echoed drug company or corporate rhetoric, suggesting in a patient leaflet produced in 2005 that antidepressants may be prescribed to correct imbalances in the levels of chemicals in the brain. So, I'm going to go back here for just a moment. And I want to read the APA spokesperson, whatever, task force of the DSM-5. When the 5th edition of the DSM-5, again, the Bible of mental health practice, was published by the APA in 2013, Dr. David Kupfer, head of the task force responsible for it, acknowledged the following. In the future, he stated in a press release, we hope to be able to identify disorders using biological and genetic markers that provide precise diagnoses that can be delivered with complete reliability and validity. Yet this promise, which we have anticipated since the 70s, remains disappointingly distant. We've been telling patients for several decades that we are waiting for biomarkers. We're still waiting. Despite this, the APA as well pushed corporate propaganda from a leaflet. So I guess literally just like a small pamphlet that antidepressants may be described to correct imbalances in the levels of chemicals in the brain. Taking a very neurocentric view and promoting that as the prevailing theory of depression. And it's just not true. It's not. I don't think I could give you more evidence at this point. So, pause it if you need to, just to sit with it for a while, but it really turns everything that we know on its head when it comes to this idea of mental illness as a biological deficiency, as a biological illness. There's some nuance to be found in that, absolutely. But I think what I was getting at with this title of this page, Market Influence in the Myth of Chemical Imbalance, is exactly that. The excerpt that I just read from Gabor Mate's book. The reality that when we look to biology as the defining reality of this thing that we're calling mental illness, as if it were a strictly or even mostly biological influence. Biology plays a role. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm not saying that it does not play a role. But to suggest that it is primarily a biological, a matter of biological disorder or deficiency or defectiveness, brain disease is not reflected in the literature, at least with respect to depression. Again, knowledge is provisional. I could be wrong when it comes to other. Again, I want to use the word designation more instead of disorder because it's just a category. It's really just a category. That's all it is. A category to describe different experiences that people have and different behaviors that people do. And that's it. But a chemical imbalance as being the centerpiece of what mental illness is just doesn't hold up under the light of evidence. So, here's some more statistics. The statistical prevalence of iatrogenic effects due to negative self-evaluations within the framework of psychiatric labeling and language is inherently difficult to establish. I'm going to read this for a second because I honestly forget what this slide is about, so I'm going to pause this right now. Okay. Man, the camera froze. God damn it. All right. That's fine. I think it'll come back on later, hopefully. All right, I'm just going to keep going. So, iatrogenesis statistics. So, this first part, I'm not going to read it again, but the Boyverse and Faust 2002 study. Basically, the takeaway from that study is it's inherently difficult to come up with solid statistics for how many people experience iatrogenesis as a result of mental health treatment, whether that's through talk therapy or whether that's through the prescription of clinical drugs for mental health disorders, right? So it's saying that it's hard to come up with an actual number for these things because it's inherently hard to define exactly what that is and to gauge at the level of research, how much harm is being produced. And I would agree with that. I think that there needs to be more investigation into and research into this topic, absolutely. And also there needs to be a more thorough analysis of how we are evaluating it. Because as we approach this topic, we're going to brush up against many of our inherent assumptions and presuppositions that we make when we talk about mental health as a whole. Okay? And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be prepared to be wrong about a lot of it and to say, you know what, this was just not the right view. We've been doing this wrong for a long time. We didn't know any better, based on what we had and based on what we were taught and based on the knowledge that was available at that point in the development of the field. But we're going to have to start doing things differently in order to ameliorate whatever harm is being done. So, how much harm is being done? Research suggests that 5% of clinical mental health patients experience adverse side effects from psychotherapy. Okay, so this is just talk therapy. Now, 5% doesn't seem like a lot, but 5% is 1 in 20 people. Kind of a lot. In terms of Americans, that's 1,325,000 Americans. Okay, and they just, for a rough estimate, that's roughly the size of Portland and Boston combined. It's not most, but it is quite a lot if you think about it. And that's just talk therapy, okay, to the best of our knowledge. Personally, I think that number is actually much higher. I think that, and this is just me, these are just my ideas, okay, and I fully acknowledge that. But I also think that it's a fairly decent argument, and that is, I think that people have a lot of factors that would lead them to report that the treatment that they're getting is beneficial when in reality it's actually harmful. And those factors might include that they want to be seen as good clients by the therapist. That's a real thing. It's a very real thing. The fact that there's a power dynamic, an inherent power dynamic at play. In good therapy, I'd say that this dynamic is the therapist will do everything to minimize this power dynamic. Okay, but there is an inherent power imbalance, generally speaking, okay, when it comes to the perceived level of expertise of the therapist as well as the level of vulnerability of the client. I'm not going to get too much into therapy discussion of therapy right now. But I'd say that that assessment is not at all, beyond the pale. I think it's a very reasonable assessment, actually. So I think that this number is much higher than 5%. But again, it's very hard to get data on this stuff. People also, I want to point out, again, this stuff is basically calling out how we practice mental health in our prevailing paradigms of mental health. So it's not something, that people are going to be making leaps and bounds to investigate and realize that, damn, we're kind of missing the mark here. There's a lot of reason not to. And anyway, again, I won't. This isn't specifically a talk about therapy. I will certainly have those in the future, but just keep this in mind. In the same way that the researchers that we were talking about before, that had led up to the development of this idea that serotonin is the primary cause of depression, right? Well, we saw that the prevailing expert view of the time turned out to be completely false, for reasons that originated, almost entirely, if not entirely, with personal factors. In other words, it didn't have anything to do with research. It had to do with the fact that people were influenced by greed, by money, right? That has nothing to do with the research itself. That has to, it does. But what I'm saying is that research itself is influenced by human error, and not just human error in terms of producing research, but human error in terms of the assumptions and biases that inevitably make their way into conducting research, and in the case of mental health, to developing forms of treatment based on that research. Okay, there will always be human biases that are wrapped up in any kind of research. We can't help that. But in order to excel and to do our best, we have to accept that that's the case in the first place, that we have inherent biases. It's a very standard truth in the field of mental health, that we have unconscious biases, and to accept that these biases make their way into the research and the ideas that found the bedrock of the field of mental health at the level of practice and at the level of research and theory. Okay, so this next point is mainly for social workers, because I'm doing a social work degree. Although most social workers, and this applies to all psychotherapists who are not psychiatrists, will likely not become psychiatrists, our diagnoses may inform PCP decisions, primary care provider, or just general practitioner decisions to prescribe psychiatric medications in areas with scarce mental health resources. Okay. So I'll just read the next statistic. According to Yale, the Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine, primary care doctors prescribe nearly 80% of antidepressant medications and see 60% of people being treated for depression in the United States. Okay, so general practitioners prescribe the overwhelming majority of the antidepressant medications that are prescribed in the U.S. Okay, that's pretty crazy. You'd think that it would be psychiatrists, but it's general practitioners, general medical doctors who do not have formal training in mental health specifically. And they're providing most of the prescriptions for antidepressant medications. Now, that's a failure of a broken system, okay? That's a failure of a broken system. That's not the doctor's fault. It's not the client's fault, for sure. It's the failure of a broken system. That we live in the richest nation in recorded human history, and we still don't have adequate healthcare for everyone. That's a broken system right there. So that's why. That's the reality. It's not the provider's fault. It's a political failure. Okay. However, so I'll read the next one. And equally, they see 60% of people who are being treated for depression in the United States. Okay, so most of the people treating depression, at least I assume that's how I'm reading this. Again, I wrote this a year ago, so I apologize if there's any discrepancies there. But most of the people who have depression and are diagnosed in this country with depression, most of them are being seen by medical doctors who do not have a specialized background in mental health. Okay? And I mean, that's wild, right? Unfortunately, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Psychotherapy, if you have insurance, if you can afford insurance, you're looking at a copay of $30 to $40. Now, that might not sound like that much to you, but for many people, that's a lot. And especially if you're doing that every week, $40 a week for most people is, a significant bill. And for many people, it's just unaffordable. And you can't go to therapy. And because you can't afford therapy, well, your doctor, who you're most likely seeing, because if you're poor, you can't afford, therapy. And so your doctor wants to give you some form of treatment, right? He doesn't just want to leave you with nothing. So he provides you with antidepressants because that's what he knows. And again, it's not the doctor's fault. It's the fault of a broken system that people don't have access to mental health, to healthcare provided by people with a specialized background in mental health for mental health problems. Okay? But as we see through, so I'll wrap up this thought. Sorry, I'll stay focused because it's starting to run long again. And I love talking about this, but I do want to make it so that it's digestible as well. So, because of this reality, psychotherapists, and I wrote this for social workers, but it applies equally to LPCs or LMFTs or any other, whatever other license there is for practicing mental health therapy. We need to be judicious in our diagnoses because there's a good chance that under our current healthcare system in 2024, that diagnosis could lead to a medical prescription of psychiatric drugs, which, as we have seen, do not benefit in treating depression at all, but actually induce harm for many people, and in some cases induce severe harm for people. through the experience of withdrawal effects from those drugs. Okay. So, I know that's a lot to wrap your head around. So that was the first point. That was iatrogenesis, right? I had a second point that I wanted to make, as one of the main failures of the medical model of mental health, right? I think I'll cover this one because it's fairly brief compared to iatrogenesis, and I recognize that took a while to get through. I mean, it's already 2 hours that we spent on that topic alone, but that just goes to show you how complex this issue is, right? And how much it really strikes the core of how we think about mental health, how we practice it at an individual level, and how we structure our social infrastructure around mental health. I can't talk when I'm tired. Sorry. I'll try to slow down again. So that was the first main failure of the medical model that I'm suggesting. And here's the second one. And again, this one's brief, so I think I can cover this, and then part 3 will be the third kind of macro view of why the medical model is insufficient, and then where we can go from there, right? So, sorry, give me one moment. My car's making a weird noise. All right, hey, sorry, the air conditioning was acting up a little bit. Okay, so the production of inaccurate mental health data. As I mentioned before, I think that this is probably the most tentative point that I wanted to make with, the main problems of clinical diagnosis. But I still think that it's a significant issue. With respect to the evidence that I have for this, I don't have any evidence for this. And that is because what I'm suggesting gets at the core, at the very foundation of mental health research itself. It's not a matter of what research do we have on this issue. I take issue with how with the methodologies and the conceptual frameworks that clinical research presupposes as a necessary first step of, even approaching research. Okay. So, I'll just go ahead. So, here's my argument. If clients are required to receive a mental health diagnosis as a prerequisite for receiving care, as we see is the case in the previous video, it logically follows that some proportion of people who do not clinically qualify for a mental health diagnosis will inevitably receive a diagnosis that is arbitrary and potentially inappropriate, solely for the purpose of being able to receive care. Okay? Again, as with the thing with the doctors and the prescription and that's the failure of a broken system. Okay? In the same way, the argument that I'm making here is not that it's the therapist's fault for. I do think that people are misdiagnosed, and that the fault is because of therapist error, honestly. But that's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is that because of the infrastructure that we have set up, which is based on the medical model of mental health, that people who don't actually clinically qualify for a mental health diagnosis, as per the DSM-5, right? That they'll have, they will necessarily get a diagnosis that is arbitrary, or potentially inappropriate, just for the sake of being able to receive continued care. Now, do I think that most therapists will try their hardest to find a diagnosis that is appropriate to, the presenting symptoms? Yes, absolutely, obviously. But I don't think therapists are inherently evil creatures. Okay. However, because of the way that the system is set up, someone's gonna get diagnosed with something that doesn't make any fucking sense, because that's what needs to happen in order for the insurance companies to be willing to pay money for that session. So, because of this, diagnoses that are not accurate or potentially are just frankly not appropriate with respect to the presenting symptoms are going to be handed out so that people can rightfully continue to have treatment and go to therapy. Okay. However, because people are receiving some proportion, I don't know what that proportion is, okay? And again, I'm questioning the validity of the diagnoses that are given themselves. So, you're not going to find research on this, because what I'm saying is that, so I'll just read it here. If some proportion of people who receive mental health treatment are inevitably receiving a diagnosis that is arbitrary or inappropriate for the sake of receiving continued care, some proportion of the data in mental health research is therefore necessarily misrepresented and inaccurate, because it's based on data gathered on how many diagnoses have been given for a particular disorder or designation within the DSM-5, and because of this, some of that data is going to be messed up, and it's not going to accurately reflect the reality of what people are experiencing and what people are having problems with. And because of that, this presents a myriad of potential problems across many domains of mental health, including, but not limited to, public policy concerning mental health, funding and resources, and the direction of mental health research in general. Okay. So here's one example that I have. ADHD. I think even the most hard-headed therapists will agree that there's kind of an epidemic of ADHD in this country. And when I say that, I don't mean that there's an actual epidemic of ADHD in this country. I mean that there is an epidemic among mental health care providers and probably certainly general practitioners, to the extent that they diagnose, even though hopefully they'll refer out to someone who has ostensibly better judgment in that area, but perhaps not, because therapists are people too, and the way that clinical diagnosis works is basically entirely subjective. Okay, I won't go into that right now, but that's the truth. And I'm not the only one who's saying this. There's a great book by a guy named Dick Schwartz. He is the founder of a orientation of therapy called IFS, in Internal Family Systems. And he argues that the notion of clinical diagnosis is largely, if not completely, unscientific. And I agree. I completely agree with that argument. I won't give that argument here, but just know that I have very strong views on that based on just bad philosophical arguments that go into producing the framework of what we regard as mental health and of clinical diagnosis. But we're trying to focus more on policy here. So, again, ADHD. So, I'm not saying there's a bunch of kids who actually have ADHD. What I'm saying is that ADHD is... diagnoses of ADHD are being given out like candy because clinical diagnoses reflect values of culture. They are predicated upon the prevailing values of the culture. So if a kid can't sit still in class, from a clinical standpoint, it's not the case that, how we educate our children is bullshit and sucks the life out of them, sucks the curiosity out of them before they even reach high school. The fact that a kid can't sit still in class is a matter of biological deficiency. They have something wrong with them. There's something wrong with their brain that they can't be a good little boy or a good little girl and just sit in their seat all day while the teacher talks to them and says things to them. There's something wrong with them at a biological level. Okay? This is the clinical view. And that therefore, when kids don't act how they're supposed to in a school setting, which is mediated by culture, what that means is mediated by culture, and that's not inherently bad, that's just inherently what it is. That this huge uptick in diagnoses of ADHD, that this is actually a reflection of the values of the culture and how people, in the case of this example, children, how much they align or don't align with the values of that culture and what it deems as appropriate behavior, what it deems as not appropriate behavior. And this extends not just to ADHD, but to all mental health designations or categories of mental health disorder. Okay? It is a reflection of cultural values. What we think that is normal for people to do, what we think that is normal for people to feel, what we think that is normal for people to believe. All of these things are mediated by cultural values and cultural standards. Okay? There's nothing scientific or empirical about that. The only chance that we have of saying that clinical diagnosis is scientific are biological markers of... So you see where I'm going with this. It's not the case that, I don't know, that this is just some like countercultural, like, I don't even know, like cultural Marxists, like whatever the fuck Jordan Peterson is talking about. But that when you look at the evidence, these ideas are simply not supported by actual empirical evidence. So, and that they can't be, because cultural values lie outside of the domain of scientific research. They belong to philosophy, to politics, to levels of emergence that science, for all of its genuine and legitimate successes, has, I mean, really very little say in. We can still use it. Again, that awesome study that I showed you is a scientific study. But what we find through the scientific literature is that there are no biological markers. Okay, I'm open to seeing research on other disorders, but when it comes to depression, at least, and I'm gonna wager this to be true for almost all mental health disorders that don't have an obvious, biological component, like, well, I'll get into that later, but something like, maybe Alzheimer's, where, the size of your brain is actually shrinking. But even then, I think that there's some interesting research to consider. But I won't get into that now. So, yeah, basically, if all these kids are being diagnosed with ADHD, right? And that's just one example, because, again, the main point I'm trying to make here is that if people are receiving diagnoses for disorders that actually don't reflect the aggregate experiences that our society is dealing with at on a collective level, people might be diagnosed with, I don't know, adjustment disorder, right? And that's a perfect example of a bullshit diagnosis that doesn't even fucking mean anything. That it literally is exactly what it sounds like, in the sense that it is, you have trouble adjusting to new life circumstances. Okay, that sounds like normal fucking people shit. That sounds like things that normal people experience. That doesn't sound like a brain disorder. And I don't believe that it is. So, this is just a hypothetical example. But let's say that, there is this, like, surge in adjustment disorder. Because that's what many people are dealing with. And, we look at all the diagnoses that have been giving out, maybe the NIMH or, some organization like that, or the APA, and they look at all the diagnoses that are given out and they say, wow, there's this huge surge in adjustment disorder. We need to allocate not all of our funding, but a substantial portion of our funding to adjustment disorder, because so many people are experiencing this. So many people are having trouble with this because we see all the diagnoses that are given out, right? Well, again, it turns out that adjustment disorder, one, doesn't mean anything, and two, that it is more likely than not an arbitrary diagnosis that is given out so that the client can continue to go to therapy, and for basically no other reason than that. And I think this is true. I think therapists on the whole have many flaws, and I promise I will get into that in the future. But I think that ultimately most therapists truly want to do good. Okay? I mean that. And so because of that, I think that these ideas are actually amenable to most therapists. Okay? Maybe less for psychiatrists, because psychiatrists have that medical background and they have that scientific, biological, conceptual framework of thinking about mental health, right? But I actually think most therapists would be open to these ideas. And with respect to adjustment disorder, I honestly think that if there was an alternative to clinical diagnosis, that no therapist would provide a diagnosis of adjustment disorder, because everyone knows that it's just meaningless. It literally just means that you're having a hard time adjusting to something new in your life. And it's a diagnosis that you give when there's no substantial symptoms of any other disorder like anxiety or depression or anything else, and you give it so that you can have something on the chart so that they can continue to see you. And that's why they give that diagnosis. So hopefully that example elucidates what I mean by inaccurate mental health data. Again, while I do think that that's potentially a substantial problem, and I really do believe that, you know, to use the example that I just gave, you know, it and maybe I'm underestimating how important this is, because this is taxpayer money ultimately that funds this research. Okay, so this is your tax dollars that is funding this research, and if we're wasting it on stupid bullshit, then I mean that's I would say that's harm to the taxpayer. So, however, because everything that I'm saying, depends so much on really getting at the foundation of how we even think about mental health in the first place, and therefore how we approach research. I don't have anything solid here, but I absolutely think that this is something that we need to investigate, and that is ultimately a direct outcome of clinical diagnosis as a core tenet of the medical model of mental health. Okay, so the third point, I'll cover that in the next video. We're almost at an hour and 20 minutes. I realize that these are long. Believe it or not, I had less than 10 minutes in my original presentation of this. In my original presentation in class, and now it's gonna be like 4 hours? Jesus, because the last one was like an hour and 20 minutes. This one's gonna be an hour and 20 minutes. I don't think the next one will be an hour and 20 minutes actually. But it'll be, around like 3 hours. But that just goes to show you how complex this stuff is. And, so next time we'll look at this idea of the medical model de-emphasizing the culture, the deficiencies in the culture and in the social environment, right? In the physical environment. And why that's a problem. And hopefully also get to the some alternatives that I propose for alternatives to the medical model of mental health. So, thank you for watching. Hopefully I'm getting better at presenting, and I try to be concise, but again, with this topic and the other topics that I explore, I really just feel like it's that complex. Um, you know, I think that last little rant. I think that like our culture has this tendency to like, oh, it's this is the problem, and it's that, and like, we blame people and like superficial factors that that's not the root of the problem. When you get into the root of the problem, you see that the roots actually spread out to a lot of different places, and that um, there's just so much complexity, and it's really a lot deeper than we think it is. So, don't be afraid to be critical. Don't be afraid to be skeptical. And don't be afraid to look for yourself. If you disagree with anything in this presentation, explore it. Say, hey, why did you skip over this? Or like, why are you focusing on this so much? And just see for yourself. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. See what you find, please. And if whatever you find, please comment in the comment section. Write me an email on my website and say, hey, I found this, or I disagree with this. Please, it'd be cool to know people are watching this, as well as that's the whole point is to really get at the truth, and we have to do that together. I don't have all of the truth. No one has all of the truth. But when we come together and really give our best, when we communicate well and share our ideas and are critical, but also open-minded to new ideas, man, it's like, God, there's just so much we could accomplish. So, anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.